Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming along to this afternoon's session. We're going to be looking at the US on the global stage, re-engaging in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. The question poses a little sort of preset some of the questions that may come through. My name's Stuart Thompson. I'm your moderator, chair for this afternoon's session, but we've got a fantastic panel, a large panel, a fantastic panel. So rather than me spending lots and lots of time going through introducing them, they're going to do a little bit of that themselves alongside their opening remarks. But I'll just spend a moment or two just setting the scene, if that's okay, and then we'll do the little introductions, and then we'll go around the panel and they can say their piece. So in recent years, there's been a gradual disengagement, it's suggested, of the United States from Europe, Africa, and the Middle East in favour of the Indo-Pacific. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 21 was the latest acts of this demobilisation. However, the conflict in Ukraine and the growing rivalry with China have put the importance of these three regions back on the table in terms of the eyes of American foreign policy makers. Following the return of the war in Europe, the United States deployed nearly 20,000 troops in the region to bolster NATO's presence. And the Biden administration has also provided logistical, military and financial support to Ukraine from the outset of the hostilities. In an effort to stem the rise in oil price, the US president has also revised his Middle East policy. Washington has pledged to provide $1 billion of food aid to the region. Finally, the White House has announced the holding of a US-Africa summit in December to discuss several issues, including food security and the climate crisis. This will be an opportunity for the Biden administration to strengthen cooperation with the African continent while defining the main areas of collaboration. The G7 countries have also planned to mobilise $600 billion to strengthen the infrastructure of developing nations. In this context, President Biden has committed his country to providing 1/3 of the agreed sum. The return of the war in Africa, the proliferation of the Chinese initiatives in Africa, and the importance of the Middle East in the global economy are three elements that are pushing the United States to the end of isolation begun under President Trump. So Washington must urgently initiate a rapprochement with the Middle East while becoming more involved in Africa by offering the continent real development opportunities while maintaining its presence in Europe. Now, that may in itself, opening statement, may evoke some comment from our panel today. I'm going to go through the fantastic panel in no particular order, I hasten to add. Mr. Miroslav Kurir is a former Prime Minister and former Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Republic of Slovenia. Mr. Thomas Petric is the former Foreign Minister in the Czech Republic. Mr. Frederick Charillon, apologies, if I mangle anybody's name terribly, please do forgive me. That's the benefit of a comprehensive education in England, means that you can't speak any languages. Sorry. Zoran, terrible, isn't it? And Zoran Zalewski, the foreign minister. Frederick. Sorry, apologies. I forgot to say that you were a professor of political science at SIOPO. Sorry. Zoran is the former Minister of Defence, a fellow at the Harvard University from the Republic of North Macedonia. We have Susan Elliott, President and CEO, National Committee on African Foreign Policy from the US. Ellen Lepson, Fellow of the President... I can't even say English words either, which, again, at the end of a long few days, unfortunately, as well. President Emeritus at the Stimson Center from the US. Ilan Berman is the Senior Vice President, the American Foreign Policy Council at the US. And Ramadan Abujar is the Director of the Brussels International Centre for Research and Human Rights from Belgium. So I think I've got everybody there. I don't think I've missed anybody out, which is the main thing that I was most concerned about. So I think if we start at this end and work our way around, if that's okay. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad that we can talk about this subject, because I truly believe that re-engagement, or let's say the first real engagement of the US in Africa and its departure from isolationism is so important now also for the Europe and for the Africa as a continent and for the peace in the world, because these are very volatile areas, and I think that by more presence of the US and also European Union, all these parts of the world can get more political stability, economic development, and also security, all kinds of security, from health security to other kinds of security. So I would like to say, as a first, to have the floor, that for any kind of for any kind of re-engagement or engagement in Africa, if I focus on the continent, we must first establish enough trust between our countries, between our worlds. This is, in my view, very important for the new start, even though we still we already have many kind of relations. But this genuine partnership is something that is really missing here in these relationships, because only, let's say, development cooperation will not suffice anymore. So we really need to establish a true, genuine economic cooperation, partnership, political partnership with African Union, with African states. And I can say that European experience here can maybe serve as something very useful also to the United States, because we have developed certain kinds of institutional cooperation, like meeting at certain summits between African Union or Africa and the European Union. Then we have regular meetings at the ministerial level, at the parliamentary level. We have also established Africa-European Foundation with several expert groups who can add some value in the field of, I don't know, let's say, for example, health, logistics, transportation, industry, economic cooperation, and also in the field of the cooperation of the civil society in both continents. And of course, we would like to empower young people, the youth representatives, to be able to cooperate as well. So I'm supposed not to be too long. Let me just wrap up with this statement that Africa is becoming very important and relevant to the world as a whole, and it must not become another, I would say, area of tensions among, let's say, superpowers or any other forces. We must do as much as we can to empower people in Africa to seize their opportunities. But at the same time, there are also many opportunities for us, for Europe, or for the United States and other parts of the world. But if you do not develop real, genuine trust between us, it will not be possible to develop these genuine relationships.
So you'd very much see the European Union as a model that the US could follow in terms of its engagement with Africa and beyond as well?
I think that there are a lot of differences, but if I may start from the very beginning, I have a background in geopolitics, but I don't want to focus too much on the geopolitics as a factor that can determine future re-engagement of US in Africa and with Europe. What I would like to stress at the beginning is that I don't see any comprehensive strategy on the US side at the moment. How to re-engage with Africa, how to exploit existing frameworks of cooperation with Europe. And I will leave Middle East to experts who know in more detail the realities of the region. But at the moment, I really don't see a comprehensive strategy, and I, at the moment, see only a kind of like wake-up moment on the US side after February of this year, when so many African countries kept their equidistance in the conflict in Ukraine. And it was more or less a question mark. Why is it? And I think that it is now a motivation for US maybe together with Europe, to think how to improve the cooperation, how to bring added value to the cooperation with African countries. And I have three probably not ideas, but kind of like food for thought issues where I think that the re-engagement can start. First of all, it is the fact that Biden administration returned to Paris Agreement, and climate change is becoming one of the key priorities for United States. And Africa is playing and will play enormously important role in terms of climate mitigation, but even more in terms of climate adaptation and the possible geopolitical impacts of climate adaptation efforts of different actors in Africa. So we need to construct a robust agenda around climate change with Africa, together with Africa, and try to help avoid the same mistakes we made in Europe and in the United States over the past at least 3 decades, but based on our economic model, much, much longer back to the history. Second issue I would like to raise is food security. It has been very neglected issue over the past 20 years, and Africa is very much affected by decisions done in US or in Europe in terms of their technological changes endorsed by United States or European Union. And we need to mainstream African concerns about the food security to our decision making and make it part of a discussion dialogue with African partners. And third idea, I think we are talking a lot about transatlantic relations in terms of US, Canada, and Europe, but Africa is also part of like transatlantic space, if I can say. We might think how to extend the transatlantic dimension into kind of like trilateralism or even quadrilateralism together with Latin America, and try to create Atlantic Ocean again as a zone which connects the 4 regions together, bring back the dynamics, and maybe rebalance also again legitimate shift of attention of many strategies towards Pacific.
Thank you. So there are a couple of specific security challenges which you mentioned there amongst your 3. So the climate change and then sort of technology and food. So you'd see some of those, the commonality, I guess, in those that help the reintegration potentially.
If any re-engagement of US with the region is going to succeed, and if African partners should have a say in it, I think these are the topics around which we should start. I'm not an expert in economics of Africa, so I'm not talking about that, but development indeed is at the end what all Africans aspire for. So this is the way towards development of Africa.
Thank you. So,
besides being former minister and professor, I have spent 7.5 years in Washington as ambassador. And when we speak about relations, there's always 2 sides of the relations. And if you allow me, I will speak about what Africa can do in Washington and how that process could help and strengthen the cooperation between Africa and US. Because our friends from US are open for dialogue and discussion, and we have to bring also our priorities to the agenda. That's our task too. Working with US society is a complex process. There are multi-stakeholders with whom you can interact. Usually in Europe, you go with the administration, with the government, with the ministries, and present your views and exchange the positions. But in US, you have more than administration. Congress is playing a very important role. The priorities, what are ours, in case what's Africans, should be also communicated with the members of Senate and members of Congress. There's always bipartisan support for cooperation with Africa from my time when I served in Washington. Also, we have to have on mind the African diaspora, which can play a very important role in keeping your priorities, your agenda included in US priorities. You have to use all those opportunities, and they are very open. I'm going to share one of my experience. He is the former Prime Minister of Slovenia. In our neighborhood, we have one state, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it was in 2009 or 10, I believe. We wanted, from the region, was very important that Bosnia and Herzegovina get some membership action plan for NATO, MAP plan. Slovenian ambassador, Roman Krin, Croat ambassador, and myself, we asked for a meeting with Senator Vojnović and Senator Shahin. Senator Vojnović, Republican, Senator Shahin, Democrat. They were in charge for Europe. And we went, we talked to them about that priority, that important issue for us. After they heard us, they said we will call Secretary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was at that time Secretary of State. And after that, they called us back and said, look, Bosnia and Herzegovina will get MAP, Membership Action Plan. It was actually conditional, but they got it. So what I want to tell you, you as a region, as a continent, you should work together and present your positions, and you will advance your agenda in Washington. That's extremely important. Then we have a third segment, which is also important, is think tank and universities. Here we have representatives of think tanks and universities talking to us. Those people are usually who are working in think tank community, but either they have been in the administration, or you can expect once they finish with their term, they go back to administration. So if you work and make them your allies, they like to hear what's your positions, and they will communicate that position to the administration and to Senate. So you're building a coalition which will help your case to be brought to the attention to the administration and advance your agenda. And also, I will be going a little bit broader, not just in Washington or Beltway, how they say. US society is quite open. United States is not just Washington. You can work with the other parts of United States. I will give you an example of my country. We have a traditional, more than almost 20 years, it's a partnership program between National Guard of Vermont and Macedonian Army. And Vermont has two senators, Senator Leahy and Senator Bernie Sanders. They were, because of that cooperation, I had access to them. And also, I could explain them what could be done. And that partnership is not just about military. It's about people to people. What the Prime Minister mentioned, connection. We had a number of programs with education, businesses, and so on and so forth. So there are many avenues which you can use to advance your agenda. And I will end with one very important, and there's a book written by President Clinton, is called Giving. United States society, they are open as individuals, not just as a country, to give, to help to the others. And you can achieve, if you know what's your strategy, you can achieve a lot going to the institutions which are having funds for your program. I will just mention just one thing. We wanted in my country to develop the heart surgery for children. We didn't have knowledge. By coincidence, one of the best surgeons in the United States from Seattle, we met with him, with the delegation, with the Prime Minister. He said, I will train you doctors, and we make possible for him to come and work with them, with our doctors, free. He was donating his time to work with our doctors to improve them. And we have 2 million inhabitants country, but we have a heart surgery in a country developed. And the last thing, we speak about economic development. That was also very high on the agenda of, when I was ambassador, I had more than 60 road shows visiting different parts of the United States to attract investments. It was just 2 in Washington. The rest were around the Washington. And I will stop here.
No, thank you. That's very kind. I hear calls for lobbying and networking amongst those the comments that you made there. And just to say to the audience before we move on to Susan, get questions ready, because we will come out to the audience for questions once we've been round first time, and hopefully we'll get a couple of rounds of questions in. So just get your thinking caps on already, Susan. Thank you.
Well, I think the ambassador just made a really good point about how the U.S. has continued, it didn't disengage from, especially from Europe and Africa and other areas of the world. And I think the thing that he mentioned, the state partnership program with the National Guard, all those people are in the military, but they're also engaged in other kinds of things and shared their activities, their knowledge with the countries that they've been engaged in. And this is a program that started really after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and I've been involved in it in many countries of the former Soviet Union, even where I was ambassador in Tajikistan. We had very good relations, and I think, U.S. people forget that U.S. is more than what happens inside the Beltway, and these people-to-people relationships that are developed and have continued over the years have not, we haven't disengaged. And I guess I would then add, in the Obama administration, and, the moderator brought that out about how the pivot to Asia, that was a strategy, pivot to Asia. I'm not sure exactly, I think it meant Northeast Asia, China looking, but, I served in Central Asia, and I really felt that there was never a disengagement there. Secretary Clinton came and visited all the countries of Central Asia when I was there. We had a lot of annual bilateral consultations. So I think there's an example of engagement. And in addition, in Europe, at the end of my diplomatic career, I run a nonprofit now that's focused on foreign policy. We do track 2 discussions. But at the end of my career, I worked at the U.S. European Command. I was a political advisor to the U.S. military. And I can tell you that, we were very engaged, even though, and at the beginning of the Trump administration, when it looked like there could be a conflict with North Korea, we were talking about how we can continue to be engaged in Europe, but help in Asia. So I guess I would say that while it may seem that we haven't engaged, but I think the engagement has been there all along. And I can tell you, even after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, one of the things that people said, well, NATO really wasn't united. Yes, it's united even more since what's happening now in Ukraine. But we had a whole program where NATO forces came together and went to the Eastern European countries. We called it the Enhanced Forward Presence, but we had not just U.S. U.S. was in Poland, but the U.K., Canada, and Germany also had not only their own troops, but NATO forces together in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then we were in Poland, and as well Romania and Bulgaria. So, and that continued into the Trump administration, even though, we heard rhetoric about Germany doesn't pay its fair share, but that's nothing new. But I think we engaged. I lived in Germany, and people were engaging all the time. And I would say, just to tell you, with Africa, again, the engagement that I saw the U.S. have, in Germany, there's the U.S. African Command, and they were engaged a lot in developing. It never meant to be a war-fighting machine, but rather to develop the military and the security in the countries of Africa, to look at ways that they could prevent common interests, prevent terrorism. And I also lived in Europe when the Syrian refugees came in 2015, but there were a lot of people who came through Italy, all across the Mediterranean from Africa. And I think that this was an example of why we all need, as one of the other panelists talked about, to work together on climate change, because these people were migrating, to look for for jobs and for, security. So I would say, and I'm very pleased to see, and most of you know that President Biden is having a summit of African leaders. There has also been African business development. So I would say that the U.S. is engaged. Could we engage more? Yes. And I do think the perception is, because I've talked with recently, people from Africa and from other areas of the world, and they think that the U.S. is only concerned about what's happening in Ukraine and, and then in having to try to figure out how we're going to have our relations with China. I would agree that we are concerned about what's happening in Ukraine and we need to resolve our issues with China. But I don't think that we have disengaged, and I just, as an optimist, hope that we continue to engage. So,
thank you. Just to pick up on that, Susan, do you think then that, if there is a perception that there has been disengagement, is that because of rhetoric, issues with previous presidents, or just a misunderstanding?
Well, I would say if you think about, I just give this as an example of the media in the U.S. If I'm the average U.S. citizen, I know everything about the war in Ukraine. I know everything that's going on there. But there's a civil war going on in Ethiopia. The Sahel in Africa is kind of, to me, in my opinion, been riddled with, taken over by transnational crime and terrorists, and we don't hear so much about that. So if you're somebody like me who's interested in, you read about it, but if you're the average person in the U.S., you know everything that's going on in Ukraine. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I'm just saying that, people have a tendency, I think, to think that we don't focus on these things, maybe because we don't broadcast them. And a lot of these people-to-people things, like the ambassador mentioned, with the state partnership program, that's one of the best programs, I think, that was ever developed after the fall of the Soviet Union, because it's really people to people. And I saw in many countries, they didn't just talk about military training, but some of the people would talk about like disaster relief. State National Guard from Maryland had a lot of people who knew how to deal with natural disaster relief, and then worked with countries on that. So I would say we have been engaged, but maybe we aren't doing a good enough job talking about good things that we do. So that's a long answer to your question.
Some good communications and PR are needed, something like that. Ellen. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So I'm really delighted at some of the examples we've already heard, and I certainly want to associate myself with the belief that there's a difference between the perception of disengagement and the reality of how the big machine of our government keeps doing a lot of programmatic work in most parts of the world. As a global power, I think the United States always has this predicament. The people who think intellectually about grand strategy say if everything's important, then nothing's important. So that whole dilemma of when you have a global capability of how do you decide what's in the front burner and what's on the back burner. So when we decide that China is what the Defense Department calls the pacing threat, that it is the kind of organizing principle for national security, the rest of the world all feels, oh my God, we're going to be neglected now. Or they look for signs that the U.S. is disengaging. Now, I assumed that the title of this session was implicitly the judgment that in the past administration, there was seen as a trend towards isolationism in the U.S., that the America First, logic of America First is we've got to think about our problems at home first, that our domestic requirements should take precedent over international engagement. And that really was truly what I think President Trump believed, and yet, sort of in a somewhat inconsistent fashion, he also wanted to be a big player on the world stage. He wanted to think that he had the kind of personal power to solve world's problems. But even while this rhetoric and this concern about isolation and disengagement is happening, as I said, there's still continuity in some of the work that the big, what you could call negatively the deep state, or you could call positively, the institutions of American governance continue to do their work. President Trump, for 4 years running, would slash foreign aid, and Congress would restore it. So even though there was a perception that we were disengaging by the headlines that said we're cutting aid by 30% to one part of the world or another, if you followed the story closely, you found out that Congress restored money to the previous years. So, for example, in the Biden administration now, the levels of aid to the Middle East and to Africa are quite similar. They're roughly almost $8 billion a year to those two regions. In the Middle East, that's spread among much fewer countries than in Africa, so you could argue that on a per-country basis or a per-capita basis, they are not equivalent, but that's in the details. We could talk about that later. So, like Ambassador Elliott, I also served in government for 25 years. My very first job was for a junior senator from a small state of Delaware called Joseph Biden. So when he was, a first-term senator, I was in graduate school and I worked for him. And he is really an internationalist, deep in his persona. He strongly believes in American leadership in the world. And I mean, this is quite consistent, I think, in his own long career in different parts of government. So I thought it would be interesting just briefly to compare how do we think about engaging in these three critical regions of the world. And on Europe, I would start with Europe and say when Biden was elected, it was crystal clear to him and the strongest priority that he wanted to persuade all of our European allies and NATO as an institution, we're back. I mean, he made that a very strong message. He came immediately to Europe. He demonstrated that the U.S. still believes deeply that we are an anchor or the anchor of transatlantic security cooperation and that the NATO alliance is absolutely essential for world peace and security. So, the Europe, I can check the box. We are re-engaged. No ambiguity there. The Middle East is a little more problematic because of this perception. But let's think about it, let's break it down into the right pieces. The forever wars had to end. They were going to end one way or the other. Even President George W. Bush is the one who actually signed the agreement for us to disengage from Iraq militarily. And here the point is that ending the wars is not the same thing as disengaging. Ending military operations still gives plenty of space for civilian, state-to-state, civil society to civil society engagement. So I do see these threads of continuity. Those wars ending gave the perception that we were somehow turning our back on the Middle East and focusing on Asia. Some of those changes that will slowly occur of pulling combat troops out of the region, downsizing some of our military facilities in the region, should not be understood to be a total 180-degree change in the relationship. I think it's much more nuanced than that. So I think that the burden is on the United States to work with partner countries in the Middle East to re-establish and revalidate where are our shared values, where are our shared interests, what kind of programmatic work is of greatest value to the countries in the region. And I very much like the point about the burden is also on the receiving country to speak up. You have a voice. You have an ability to say, this is more important to us than something else. So now, we are a little bit in an awkward place after the Arab Spring. How much can we promote good governance and democratization and human rights in the Middle East? There is a lot of resistance to the U.S. trying to set that agenda for Middle Eastern countries. So it's not that everything is smooth sailing, but I think we want to just characterize as correctly as we can what the level of American engagement looks like. And lastly, others know much more about the African engagement than I do, but it is my impression that the Africa Summit coming up in December is a really big deal. In the past, the engagement has been on entrepreneurship, training young leaders, economic growth. Those were pillars of U.S.-African engagement in the last year or so, and I'm glad to hear that climate change and public health cooperation will be featured this year. We should say that unlike other regions of the world, a vast majority of the aid we give to Africa is on public health. And that comes from HIV/AIDS, where President Bush, dramatically increased our commitment to creating public health capacity in African countries. We also do education, we also do security cooperation, but health is a dominant topic of the U.S.-African partnership. So I think I'll end there, but maybe come back to some of these issues later.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's great. Do you believe then, I mean, picking up your, the point you made about sort of military withdrawal isn't the same as withdrawal from civil society, take Afghanistan as the example here. Do you know, in that sort of circumstances, do you think the US has done enough to keep that cultural and civil society engagement going, or was the withdrawal of troops seen as almost an endpoint, particularly in that case?
Well, I would argue that it's not just the withdrawal of the troops, it's the way our bureaucracy changed its own behavior during the era of terrorism. Our embassies became a little bit more inwardly focused. This Benghazi in Libya, remember, was a big shock to the administration, where so embassies, I think, are a little less relaxed and a little less available to go out and meet all kinds of people in civil society. So we have to change our behavior, and if we can now put that 20 years of, with terrorism being the primary, sort of organizing principle of American engagement, if we can put that back in perspective and let our young diplomats get out and engage and do more programmatic activity. If I could just make two other very quick points. One is that don't think of American engagement as just the US government. The role of civil society, including as aid donors, is extraordinary. Extraordinary. The Gates Foundation, what Google does. I mean, we have private sector players that are bigger philanthropists than sometimes government-to-government aid. So keep that in mind. But I did want to I meant to put out one little word of warning on this question of isolationism. It is part of the American political discourse that the U.S. should not have as much responsibility for the problems of other countries. So if we see Republicans dominating the Congress, if we see the return to a republic, if Biden turns out to be a one-term president and we elect part of the Trump-led Republican Party back to power in 2025, isolationism will be considered, is part of the debate. It is part of the discourse. So I don't think we can claim that it's, with Biden's election somehow, it's permanently resolved. And I know that many countries in the world do worry that, that was Trump exceptional, or was the Trump America First philosophy really part of the American political tapestry and part of the bifurcation of political values that we're seeing in a polarized American society. So we can't promise you that the spirit of engagement is a permanent condition. There is still, I think, there are other forces in American society that would argue for scaling down our role in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to that point later on in the panel as well. Ilan.
Sure. Well, and I want to piggyback a little bit off of what Ellen said, because I think she made a really profound point at the beginning. We're not talking about re-engagement so much as optimizing engagement. Engagement is ongoing, and the American government is a big government, and even if there's not top-level attention, there is mid-level attention from these different agencies. But a note of caution here, because I think it's important. The U.S. Defense Department has this interesting way of phrasing things. To quantify success, they compare measures of output and measures of effectiveness. And what we see in Africa is a lot of measures of output, not a lot of measures of effectiveness. You see a lot of activity by U.S. government agencies, but you don't see an overarching strategy. In fact, I would make the argument you haven't seen an overarching strategy for a long time, if ever. And it doesn't mean that different administrations weren't engaged. For example, under the Trump administration, and I know this because I worked with the folks at the NSC when they were thinking about Africa, they were looking at Africa as an arena of competition. Competition with China, competition with Russia, competition with Iran, and even Daesh, even the Islamic State. But they weren't thinking about Africa for Africa's sake. When you looked at the Obama administration, there was a lot of diplomatic engagement, but there wasn't a strategy. I mean, let's be honest, there wasn't a strategy. When you think about the Bush administration, there was even less, right? So you have this ongoing what I would argue is a massive strategic error, right? An undervaluing of Africa. All right, so let me sort of tell you a story. All of the Americans are going to smile because they all know this story. Some of you may know as well. So there is a famous guy, famous for all the wrong reasons, in American history named Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton, for those of you that don't know, was an American bank robber. And he robbed banks in Pennsylvania and Ohio in the 1930s and 1940s. He was very notorious. And when law enforcement finally caught up to him, they put him in a room. And by the way, I'm sure this story didn't actually happen, but this is how it's told. They put him in a room and they said, "Hey, Willie, why do you rob banks?" And he said, "It's because it's where the money is," right? And I think that's a really apt story to tell in the context of Africa, because Africa is where the action is going to be. Africa is where the people are. Right now, we have a continent of 1.4 billion people. By 2050, this continent is going to grow to 2.5 billion people, which means that Africa is going to have more than a quarter of the world's population. Africa is also the world's youngest continent, right? It's a continent of babies. The median age in Africa is 19.4, right? So what you're seeing in terms of this combination, this explosive demographic growth, and this youth, is tremendous dynamism in society. You see massively emerging markets, and markets that are emerging very quickly. You see rapid digitization, and sort of all the dark things that come along with it, corruption and sort of fragile institutions. But outside powers are increasingly figuring this out, and they're scrambling to get in on the game, to get in on the action. And this is where I think America, frankly, is falling down. America needs to see Africa in strategic context, right? We had a panel earlier today, and we talked about U.S.-China great power competition. Africa is an integral to the conversation about U.S.-China competition, because this is, I would argue, this is the continent where China is the most engaged. It's the most dynamically engaged in terms of infrastructure, in terms of tech. And it's the continent where the Western public opinion about China as a troubling actor, if not a malign actor, is not the same as it is in the West. In the West, we're all talking to each other, and we have a general consensus about what we think about China. But it breaks down when you come to Africa. So there's a lot of work to do here. And tactical solutions, at least in the near term, I think are very possible, right? We heard from the speakers earlier, we heard from the Prime Minister from the Foreign Minister about food security, right? Food security is a enormous tactical solution that the U.S. is positioned to provide. The U.S. is positioned to enhance investments in regional food banks and sort of regional cooperation as a way of strengthening human security on the continent. We can double down on, for example, counterterrorism assistance. I don't know if you've noticed, but this continent is undergoing a devolution in terms of the fight against Islamic extremism, right? You're seeing more and more the Islamic State migrating out of the Middle East into North Africa, south from North Africa into Central Africa, into places like Lake Chad, and places like Mozambique becoming real hotspots, real sources of concern. These are things that the U.S. can help with if the U.S. re-engages meaningfully on issues like counterterrorism. But the bottom line here, and I think, is that Africa needs alternatives, right? And the West is in a position to supply them. And I hope very much that there's going to be greater appetite in Washington to supply them, because if we don't supply them, other countries are going to step into this void. And I'm thinking in particular about China. So this is sort of a competitive environment. It's an enormously promising environment, but it's someplace where the United States needs to, I think, much more meaningfully engage.
So that would be a positive agenda for the US to engage with. Can it do so and be not too negative about, say, the Chinese investment as well? Does the US have to deal with that carefully, or can it deal with that sort of head on if it wants to maintain relations?
So I think it's a great question, and I'll make the point that I made in the earlier session, which is that the US. So I have a friend who used to work in journalism and marketing, and he always says that in order to sell people aspirin, you first have to convince them they have a headache. So we in the United States have figured out that we have a China headache, right? We are sort of, we know we have a China headache. What we don't have is a good aspirin, a good painkiller for the headache. So we spend a lot of time talking about competition with China. We don't spend a lot of time doing competition with China. And Africa is the perfect example of this, where there are governments on this continent that would like alternatives to dependency on Chinese tech, dependency on companies like Huawei and ZTE. We have to be in a position to provide them, because we have to understand these are leaders that are staring down the barrel of these rapidly expanding demographics. They need to deliver for their populations now. They can't wait, right? The line I used earlier this morning is, America's the aspirational power, and China's the present power. And we have to figure out how to change that equation so we're present as well.
Thank you. Ramadan.
Bonsoir. Good evening, everybody. I would like to speak on Arabic if you take the... أشكر ميديز والمغرب على إتاحة الفرصة لنا للحديث عن مواضيع هامة تخص ملف دائم في منتدى ميديز: العلاقات الأمريكية، الأفريقية، الأوروبية ومع الشرق الأوسط تراجعت بشكل كبير جدا وتحتاج إلى إصلاح، سواء تحت حكم الجمهوريين أم الديمقراطيين. وسوف أبدأ بأوروبا وليس بأفريقيا. عندما كان الرئيس ترامب يزور بروكسل كان يهين القادة الأوروبيين وكان يتعامل معهم بعدم احترام. قام بسحب 10,000 جندي مارينز أمريكي من ألمانيا دون إشعار للدولة الألمانية، وأيضا كان يتحدث دائما عن قارة أمريكا وكوكب أمريكا بعدم احترام للإرث التاريخي للشريك الاستراتيجي للولايات المتحدة وهي القارة الأوروبية. وفي حقبة بايدن تفاءل الأوروبيين بعودة العلاقات الأمريكية الأوروبية من جديد. للأسف بايدن عاقب الأوروبيين بشدة في أول زيارة له لبروكسل عندما طالب دول الاتحاد الأوروبي للذهاب معه في مواجهة الصين في حربه مع الصين، وكان الرد الأوروبي دبلوماسيا أن دول أوروبا ليس لديها حربا مع الصين ولكن سوف تتعامل مع الصين وفق القوانين الدولية. لم يعجب ذلك بايدن، فقامت الإدارة الأمريكية بالسطو على صفقة الغواصات الفرنسية الأسترالية، وكانت عدد كبير من الشركات الأوروبية يعمل في هذه الصفقة. أيضا السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية دائما كانت تواجه أو تختلف كثيرا مع السياسة الأوروبية. إذن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لم تحترم أوروبا إلى أن وصلنا إلى الحرب التي أقلقت العالم جميعه، الحرب الروسية الأوكرانية. الأداء الأمريكي أو أداء بايدن لم يكن هو المطلوب أوروبيا. أوروبا لا كانت تريد أن توقف الحرب وتسعى إلى حل سلمي وتريد أن تضغط على بوتين لوقف الحرب أو لمنع الحرب. أما الإدارة الأمريكية كانت تستدرج بوتين للبدء بهذه الحرب. إن لم أكن مخطئا بدأت أوروبا تنحى منذ سنوات للاستقلال بالقرار الأمني والسياسي الخارجي على الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وكانت هناك محاولات فرنسية لإنشاء جيش أوروبي مستقل. أول أمس كانت زيارة للمستشار الألماني إلى الصين، وهنا تحدي أو خروج عن العباءة الأمريكية أو احترام للمصالح الألمانية. عندما لم تحترم الإدارة الأمريكية مصالح شركائها وحلفائها الأوروبيين، من الضروري أن تضطر هذه الدول للبحث عن مصالحها حتى لو خارج العباءة الأمريكية. هناك الكثير من نقاط الاختلاف، حتى داخل حلف الناتو كان حلفا هزيلا، وأعادت إحياؤه هذه الحرب، وكأن حرب أوكرانيا بقدر ما سببت الأذى والخسارة الكبيرة لكل الدول الأوروبية شرقية وغربية، هي قامت فقط بإفادة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. الخروج إلى الشرق الأوسط، الشرق الأوسط كله بشكل عام، وتحدث عن الدول العربية خاصة دول الخليج، مصر، المغرب، هذه دول صديقة تاريخيا للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. هذه الدول حليفة بالفعل للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ولم يسبق أن اعترضت كثيرا، ولكن ماذا فعلت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لاحترام وللحفاظ على العلاقة مع هذه الدول العربية؟ كانت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تستخدم الفيتو في كل مرة يتم انتقاد إسرائيل، وهذا على يحرج القادة العرب أمام شعوبهم. حتى بعد توقيع اتفاقية إبراهيم للسلام، الدول العربية وقعت هذه الاتفاقات لدعم معسكر السلام داخل إسرائيل. اليوم يأتي من إسرائيل معسكر متطرف جدا، والحل يعتقد العرب وأعتقد أنا دائما في يد الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، سواء كان ديمقراطيين أو جمهوريين، السياسة لم تختلف، إلى أن ظهر مؤخرا نوع من التحدي، نوع من العناد العربي والرفض العربي للسياسات الأمريكية. كيف يمكن للرئيس بايدن والإدارة الأمريكية أن تطلب من المملكة العربية السعودية ودول أوبك بلس أن تضحي بخسارة بمليارات الدولارات من أجل دعم بايدن سياسيا؟ هذا لا يجوز. وعندما رفضت 30 دولة أوبك بلس رغبة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وقررت تخفيض إنتاج النفط للحفاظ على الأسعار، أرادت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية أن تعاقب السعودية فقط، أو السعودية والإمارات، وبدأت الأقلام في الواشنطن بوست والصحف للكتاب الديمقراطيين بانتقاد ومهاجمة الدول العربية. في الوقت التي تقوم به إيران بقمع المواطنين وقتل خارج القانون والتعذيب داخل السجون، تكتفي الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بالإعراب عن القلق وتستمر في التفاوض مع الخبراء الإيرانيين في فيينا. والكارثة الأكبر أن تقوم الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بالإفراج أو للسماح لإيران بتصدير 1.5 مليون برميل نفط يوميا، بدلا أن تعاقبها على القمع اليومي للمتظاهرين السلميين وقتل النساء في السجون الإيرانية. لو حدث ذلك في إحدى الدول العربية أعتقد أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية كانت سوف تتخذ إجراءات صلبة وقاسية. أما فيما يتعلق بأفريقيا، الوجود الأمريكي قديم في أفريقيا ولكن كان بخجل. تطور الوجود الأمريكي بأفريقيا لمناكفة الوجود الصيني أو لمتابعة ومراقبة الوجود الصيني الذي بدأ منذ 25 عاما بالتواجد بشكل قوي في أفريقيا. وأيضا كان عبارة عن بعض القواعد العسكرية الموجودة في جيبوتي، وكانت لهم تجربة في الصومال سيئة، ولديهم شركات أمريكية تنافس الشركات الفرنسية في أفريقيا، القارة التي لم يحترمها لا الأوروبيين ولا الأمريكيين. أفريقيا تستحق احتراما أكبر من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. القادة الأفارقة يجدون صعوبة في الوصول إلى صانع القرار في الإدارة الأمريكية، والإدارة الأمريكية لم تبدي احتراما لأفريقيا إلا من خلال الخطابات السنوية لبعض أعضاء الكونغرس أو حتى الرئيس الأمريكي. أعتقد أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية قد تراجع دورها في هذه المناطق الثلاث. لا زالت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية هي الدولة الأعظم في الحضارة والقوة والاقتصاد، وفي كل الأمور العالم يحتاج الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ولكن العالم يحتاج إلى قيادة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الصالحة وليس الشريرة. لماذا حلفاء الولايات المتحدة من عرب وأوروبيين ينظرون إليها اليوم وكأنها شريرة؟ أعتقد أن الخطأ في من يقود البيت الأبيض سواء من ديمقراطيين أو جمهوريين. عليهم احترام الحلفاء والشركاء على هذا الكوكب، وعليهم أيضا معاقبة المتطرفين ودعاة خطاب التطرف، وليس محاباة النظام الإيراني ومحاباة اليمين المتطرف في إسرائيل. وشكرا.
Thank you. Sorry, just making sure I got the last of your comments there. So the suggestion then is that that re-engagement isn't yet happening. If the US is to re-engage, if it is to take a more positive line, as if you've suggested, would there be a couple of key points that you would sort of suggest that would enable the US to do that? Sort of 2 or 3 key points, and that would shift perceptions.
فيما يتعلق، نعم، الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية يجب عليها إعادة النظر في السياسات الأمريكية الخاطئة. عندما قامت باحتلال العراق وتسليم العراق إلى إيران، هذا لم يكن مطلوبا عربيا، وهذا لا يصب في مصلحة العرب. هو هدية كبيرة إلى إيران ضد مصلحة العرب. عندما يقوم الحوثيين بقصف السعودية والإمارات وتقوم إدارة بايدن بسحب الحوثيين من قوائم الإرهاب، هذا تصرف خاطئ. أعتقد على الإدارة الأمريكية أن تتحدث بلغة احترام مع الدول العربية، عليها أن تتفهم مخاوف هذه الدول. عندما توقع إدارة بايدن وتعود إليها اليوم إدارة أوباما، واليوم تعود إدارة بايدن، الاتفاق النووي الإيراني 5+1 بدون استشارة الدول العربية ودون إشراك دول الخليج، خطر النووي الإيراني سوف يصيب الدول الأقرب. أيضا سلوك إيران المزعزع للمنطقة ودعم الميليشيات، حتى أصبحت إيران تدرب ميليشيات عسكرية هنا لتزعزع استقرار المغرب. هناك تقارير وهناك شكاوى مغربية في الأمم المتحدة ولجامعة الدول العربية عن قيام إيران بتدريب وميليشيات من حزب الله أيضا بتدريب البوليساريو لمحاربة الشعب العربي المغربي. هذه الإجراءات غير مقبول الصمت الأمريكي عليها، والإدارة الأمريكية تعي جيدا، هي تريد أثمان مقابل الصداقة. الصداقة والعلاقة المحترمة تبنى بين الدول بالاحترام المتبادل وبتبادل المنافع، وليس بالضغط وابتزاز الدول العربية. اليوم للأسف أقول لك أن هناك مزاج عربي غاضب جدا من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. لا أقول أنه يقترب من المعسكر الروسي أو الصيني إطلاقا، ولكن أصبح هناك هوية عربية جديدة ترفض الإرادة الأمريكية، وهذه الهوية العربية كانت دائما إلى جانب كل الحكومات الأمريكية. إذن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية هي الخاسر الأكبر في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، على الأقل خسرت ثقة الأوروبيين. وأؤكد لك أن معظم الدول الأوروبية لم تعد تشعر بارتياح بل وثقة في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. أفريقيا هي بعيدة عن العلاقات الاستراتيجية مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ولكن أفريقيا هي قريبة للعرب وللأوروبيين.
Thank you. Thank you for that challenge, and I'm sure we'll get some reaction to those points shortly as well. Frederick, last on the panel there, but very not least at all.
Thank you very much. So it was a pleasure to be here at the MEDays and in Tanger and in Morocco in general. Just 3 points, because we have to keep some time for a debate. First point, of course, in the title, we have 3 very different situations: Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Nothing to do at the moment. Second point, I don't believe in the US disengagement, not even to talk about the US decline. I don't believe in that. But third point, very quickly, I reassure you, I do believe in the uncertainty of the American foreign policy in the coming years. So first point, nothing to do between Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. In Europe today, and mostly because of Ukraine, there is a demand for an American presence and an American engagement. Not re-engagement. Yes, maybe it is felt, it is perceived as a re-engagement, but United States has always been there in Europe. But now, yes, there is a demand, especially in countries like the Baltic states, in Poland, and in many others. So there is a real demand. Maybe not forever, and maybe this could change. Take the case of France. I'm from France. I think you have. I'm not totally sure of that, but we are close, if it's not already the case, of a majority at the French National Assembly of a kind of anti-American foreign policy. I think that today, if you add the votes of the extreme right, the extreme left, plus the part of the former Gaullist party, I think you have a majority of members of the parliament who are strongly anti-American, and some of them are pretty close to Russia and others. So this could change. But today, since President Macron is still in the classic line of friendship, of a transatlantic friendship and friendship with the United States, and so on, we could say that globally Europe has a demand for a strong American presence for a reason of protection and guarantee of security. It's not the case in Africa and the Middle East, where there is a growing feeling of not necessarily anti-Americanism, but defiance against the West. And we could see the votes at the UN on the Ukrainian issue, but we can also take a look at the sanctions and the countries who don't want to apply sanctions against Russia. They don't want to choose. They don't want to be taken between the two sides. They remain very careful. And so these are very different situations. And the case of the Middle East has always already been discussed, so I won't be long on that. But the case of the Middle East is special because the presence of the US and the influence of the United States depends strongly on a few specific strong relationships. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and the strange case of Turkey, because Turkey we don't have the time to develop it here, but Turkey is a very special case because it's a NATO country whose foreign policy has evolved a lot. So three very different situations, a stronger and stronger demand of US presence in Europe, maybe a rising criticism against the US in the two other regions. I don't believe in the US disengagement. I don't believe in the US decline. How many times have the scholars and the academics predicted the demise or the decline of the U.S. foreign policy? Sometimes the U.S. scholars themselves too, post-American world, restraint, and so on and so on. But I don't really believe in that for one simple reason. I don't see for the moment any alternative to the structuring power of the United States in the field of security, in the field of financial and economic partnerships. I don't think that can Russia or China replace the United States as a partner for Turkey, for many countries in Africa. I don't believe so. I don't think so. Can the U.S. be replaced by China or Russia as a partner or a strategic partner for Saudi Arabia? I don't think so. So maybe the feelings are pretty harsh sometimes, but I don't think that today any peer competitor, if we can call them so, like Russia or China, I don't think they can replace the structuring role of the United States in those regions. So I don't think that there is a disengagement or a decline. But the problem, as we all know, and it has been addressed already, especially by Mrs. Leibson, the problem is the uncertainty of the future of U.S. foreign policy. Of course, the Trump years have caused quite some emotions among the partners and the allies of the United States. We know it can still happen. Imagine Donald Trump back at the White House today, everything changes, especially for Ukraine. Everything changes in many regions of the world. Not the same sound at all. Not the same foreign policy at all. So we all know that this kind of uncertainty can happen again. We don't know what is the future of the American foreign policy. We also know that the United States usually has a kind of tradition of reducing the international relations to one specific goal of national interest. It was the war on terror some years ago. Today it seems that China is the new priority, but Russia invited itself in the debate, but China is the new priority. We all know that it can change, and we have seen that this very American way of trying to focusing on one specific priority is perceived as something very unpleasant in many regions of the world. This perception of being obliged to follow an American agenda, war on terror, and now competition with China, and then something else, and the rest doesn't exist anymore. Forget about the rest. This is our priority, so this priority should be your priority too. We can see that it is a problem. It is a problem in the U.S. foreign policy. So we don't know what will be the future of the U.S. foreign policy. So these were my points, actually. I don't think there is a re-engagement because I don't think there is disengagement, and I don't think there is decline, but the uncertainty is very high.
Do you think then that Europe in some instances is looking for the US to take a lead on certain issues, whether that be economic climate change, whatever. Is that where Europe is, where Brussels is, or is it quite happy, or is it wanting more of a partnership?
I think, well, the U.S. leadership is a real question. When Biden was elected, one of his most famous leitmotif was "America is back." Like we can do the leadership again. We can be the leaders again. The problem is, things have changed between during the 4-year Trump years, and so the question now is: does America want to wield leadership? Does the world want an American leadership again, or do we have to reinvent the type of American leadership? There is a debate in the United States, like soft balancing, restraint, or what is the good method for the U.S. to find a role which cannot be the same old role of leadership as decades ago. It's not possible. So everything remains to be reinvented, and it's not an easy task for the coming U.S. president if they want to do so, because I don't think that Donald Trump wants to think about that too much.
Thank you. I want the panel to sort of reflect on what each other has been saying, but I'm also very keen to get questions from the audience as well. So we've got three. I tell you what, let's see if this works. I'll try and take the three questions. This might be a little bit optimistic. Anyway, we'll go with this. We'll try and do the three. And I think probably rather than everybody answering all the questions, as long as we cover all three questions and a little bit of reflection, we'll try and do it if that works with the audience. So question one here, the lady here. Question two at the back in the semi-dark list that I can't quite see. And the gentleman there as well. So let's take those three.
Premièrement, je m'appelle Oumaima, étudiante en 2e année dans la fac économie. Je veux parler en arabe. J'ai une question pour موارد الأمم المتحدة تجاه هذه الأحداث التي تقوم بها الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، لأن الأمم المتحدة هدفها هو سلم السلام العالمي. فكما ذكرت هناك كارثة دبلوماسية بين دول العالم، وهل إذا استمر الوضع هكذا ستكون هناك حرب عالمية ثالثة؟ لأن الوضع بدأ بين روسيا وأوكرانيا ثم تطور الوضع. هل سيكون هناك حرب عالمية ثالثة؟ وشكرا. Merci.
Brilliant, thank you. Question right at the back.
Merci beaucoup. Je m'appelle Alassane Suleiman. Je suis journaliste, pigiste, en tout cas freelance. Je viens du Mali, en Afrique de l'Ouest. Voilà, ça me fait 10 MEDays sur 14. Donc, je suis très intéressé par les questions des relations internationales, de diplomatie et de beaucoup de choses. Alors, ma question peut-être à Madame Leibson. Je voudrais savoir, au début des années 90, beaucoup de pays africains ont embrassé la démocratie, sont devenus démocratiques. Alors, 30 ans après, la démocratie est en crise en Afrique. On a des coups d'État un peu partout, et notamment en Afrique de l'Ouest. On sait que la philosophie diplomatique des États-Unis, c'est la démocratie d'abord. Avant tout, toute chose pour pouvoir avoir la coopération avec les États-Unis. Alors, Madame Leibson, est-ce que dans notre monde aujourd'hui un peu en tourmente, est-ce que les États-Unis continuent toujours avec leur philosophie de la démocratie d'abord pour avoir la coopération avec les États-Unis, ou bien les États-Unis vont changer un peu leur vision avec le monde que nous avons aujourd'hui? Merci beaucoup.
Brilliant, thank you. Challenging question. And third?
Hello. Oh, thank you. My name is Andrew Leung. I'm an independent China strategist, and I'm speaker on 3 panels, including one on U.S.-China relations. Now, China has an outsized influence, or in at least relationship, with Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, because China is now the second largest economy in the world, and it's the largest trading partner for something like 130 countries in the world, compared with something like 90 for the United States. And of course, China sits right at the heart of the global supply and value chain. So rather than decoupling from China, which doesn't seem to be working very well, should the United States take the initiative to draft China into a more sustainable kind of dialogue, perhaps on a multi-track basis, including both formal and informal kind of channels, including NGOs and think tanks all the way, and also not involving only the United States and China, but other countries, because any conflict between the United States and China is going to implicate not only these two countries, but the rest of the world. So my question is that should the United States really think about taking the initiative to draft China into a more sustainable model to manage the two relationships, but also to involve China into resolving some of the dynamics and conflicts that plague the rest of the world? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So 3 challenging questions there. One on the role of the UN, one directly on the role of democracy, and that broader question around China and the US. So do you want to take the sort of direct one first, Alan, and then I think we'll open it up, and I wonder whether people just want to volunteer to take or deal with particular parts, and then I can pick on people if needs be.
Thank you, Stuart. Is this on? Hello? Oh, there we go. So for my Malian friend, I think that democracy promotion will always be a core pillar of how the United States wants to engage in the world, because it is so deep in our own identity that the belief that democracy is still the most organic way to make sure that governments reflect the will of the people. So it's a very basic, simple principle. It is also true that democracy promotion hasn't worked everywhere, or that as a global trend, democracy has been challenged. Technology, the speed with which people can communicate, has eroded people's respect for the slow institutional game of democracy. You have to be patient. Things take a long time. You have to consult everybody's points of view, etc. So there's an erosion of a belief that democracy is efficient enough to address the world's problems, and that debate is happening in the United States as well as in our relationship with others. So I believe that and we've somewhat shifted the vocabulary to good governance. We do believe that it's the choice of other societies to decide what form of governance is right for them. But we need governance. We don't want to live in a world of absolute anarchy. Governments still perform absolutely essential functions. And so I think the United States has somewhat adapted. We still have programs that promote democratic processes and change. We support how countries develop, rule of law, freedom of expression, political party development, judicial systems. We still believe in all of that. But I think we have to, adjust to the needs and the requirements of individual countries. So I think we are also a little bit humble right now about the challenges to democratic behavior in our own country. I'm certainly of the camp that wants to revalidate democracy as may not be a perfect form of government, but it's better than the alternatives. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Anybody else on democracy, or should we move on to the UN? Move on to the UN. Anybody want to say? Yes, thank you.
Well, on the UN, I think you raised a really good question about the need for, in my opinion, reform of the United Nations. The United Nations was formed after the Second World War, and it reflected the world and what the world needed at that time. But I think we are seeing that, that perhaps there needs to be reform. I'm not going to say that's going to be easy. And in terms of the veto, I think that you've raised a good point that it's not just China and Russia, but all members of the Security Council, including my own country, the United States of America, use the veto to their own political advantage. So whether, there could be an override of the veto from the General Assembly. We heard some remarks this morning about that the UN doesn't really serve all the countries of the world, but just serves the powerful countries. But the UN does a lot of good things in terms of their programs, through the UN Development Agency, UNICEF, the UN High Commission on Refugees. So those are all things that are important too, but I would agree with you that, I think someone put this yesterday, people who have power, it's very difficult for them to give up the power. So I think it would be very difficult for any of the countries of the Security Council to give up the veto that they had, but I think it's something that there should be serious discussion about.
Thank you. I know the issues China's been discussed at length in other sessions as well, but if there's any particular points that anybody would like to make on that in terms of the challenge, if not, I'll open it up to other questions. I certainly have one question, which is about the shifting. So, anybody? Yeah, China, if you want. Yeah, China, sorry. Yes, go on, Frederick. Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, there's already been a session, so it's really for others that haven't had the chance to comment on it. So,
I don't have any revolutionary thing to tell you, but I think that the problem I don't think that anyone, China or the US, has any interest in a growing confrontation. Just rivalry would be already okay. I don't believe in the concept of a new Cold War, because I think it's something we hear very much about, is there a new Cold War between the US and China, and each of them accuse each other of being at the origin of a new Cold War. I don't think this term is right, because Cold War was something very different in another world with two separate systems, so nothing to do with the Cold War. But the real problem today probably is that many countries would like to avoid being obliged to choose a side. And I don't think that this obligation is the same everywhere in the world. I think that a new bipolarity between China and the US doesn't make sense in the Middle East. I don't think it makes sense in Africa, in spite of very strong Chinese presence. It makes sense in Southeast Asia, and it makes sense in Asia, where countries like Thailand or Singapore don't want to be caught in this new game. And so I think that it is in the interest of the two powers in Beijing and in Washington to find a way to rule their rivalry and the competition, so that the countries, especially in Asia, don't feel obliged to choose a side. Because if they do, if they feel obliged, everybody will be the losers, Washington and Beijing. I really think so. So nobody has an interest. Unfortunately, we all know that in international relations, it's not because nobody has an interest in something that this something doesn't happen. It can happen. And nobody wants it, but it can happen. So the two countries should establish clear rules to make sure they avoid this situation. That's my feeling.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other questions from the... Yep, let's take the question now.
Can you hear me?
If you keep talking, it should kick in.
The name is Ayman Barraj from Morocco, studying in second year logistics and transport. My question is, seeing that some African countries have been getting help and aid from the US for the last 10, 20 years, and they are still, to this day, need just as much help, if not more. What is the end goal here, knowing that there is not as much success? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, or should we take that one? Okay, let's take that question. Yep, hello. Thank you.
He was looking at me, so I think...
You volunteered. So.
No, that's fine. So I think that's an excellent question, and I think it goes to what Ellen was talking about this international engagement fatigue that is ever present in the American political dialogue. A great example in this context is Afghanistan, right? The Biden administration has gotten a lot of bad press about how it did the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But let's be clear, the political logic of the withdrawal was bipartisan. President Trump, when he was in office, said that if he got a second term, he would have withdrawn, and he would have withdrawn sooner. He would have withdrawn in May, not in August, right? So he was looking, President Biden was looking at the same polls as Donald Trump was looking at, that the American people are tired of these open-ended engagements, right? These forever wars, for lack of a better term. And I think that's a lesson that's applicable also to international aid. The United States is enormously generous in terms of its international engagement. We very often, local populations and local publics don't actually know that the U.S. is doing anything because we have this aversion to, as they say at the USAID, of putting flag on the bag, right? Of letting people know that this is actually our aid. Personally, I think that's a mistake. I think if you're being generous, it's good for people to know that you're being generous, right? There's no downside to that. But the reality is that also is not an indefinite condition. There has to be some level of evolution that comes along with the aid, right? My main criticism of the Trump administration's Africa strategy, and they sort of had an Africa strategy, was they called it Prosperity Plus, right? And it was unveiled by John Bolton in December of 2019. They never really got to implement it, but the idea was to provide additional aid to African countries, and the rest of the conversation was silent. The rest of the sentence was silent. For what reason? Why would you provide additional aid, right? Do you provide it for good governance? Do you provide it for anti-corruption? Do you provide it for greater security? So that's the part of the conversation that isn't evolved. And that's why over time, when you have countries that receive aid from the United States, but still need it or still need more or whatever it is, or are not progressing along the democratic path, that's why you get resistance and pushback from Washington. So my sense is, I think the answer to your question lies in us, we Americans, identifying achievable, realistic objectives upon which to pin our aid. And we've started doing that. We have something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which tries to do that. But I think we can do a much better job of sort of organically linking those things. And I think it would be helpful not only for us to prevent fatigue, but also for recipient nations to understand what's expected of them. So.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. Thomas.
I would like to add a little bit on what has been said, because good governance, mentioned several times here, is part of the story. You can give a lot of aid, but if it is not translated into sustainable local activity and ownership, which can govern, which can manage, direct the projects, maintain the sustainability, and translate it into economic local development and activity. It is a never-ending story then. I think this is the lesson of all American, European development agencies, that good governance is precondition. And now we are back to also where we now stand in our own deliberation, where to go on with the development assistance in general, because we would like to see more of the local ownership at the same time, and it's part of the discussion about whether US and Europe is giving up on promoting democracy. No, because our aid is most effective where local institutions work. They can take over the projects supported. They can manage them in the long run and transfer it into like local economic activity in a way, and bring in, for example, like investment. If you, for example, invest in infrastructure and nobody is maintaining the infrastructure, then you can bring in another project in 5-10 years. And we have seen on a number of occasions, France, Germany, US, even my country, even though we are not so active, that you pay a lot of money for a project, and when you don't care about how it's going to be sustained by local authorities, you can return back in 5 years, and the project is not working any longer. So this is a problem that you very often see a lot of progress, even though there are billions of dollars coming in official assistance. It's largely because we are facing the dilemma to give the local ownership, and then you are not giving aid to where it is needed, or give aid to places where you know that you will have to return back in 5-10 years again, because you will see the progress on local governance.
Thank you. Sorry.
I would like to to add something in this respect. When we look at development in general, that's a complex area where we can, where U.S. government, but also European governments and other donors are having a comprehensive approach. It's good governance, which is very important. Also education, healthcare system, as well as engagement of private sector. Now, what the last years we were seeing, and was also in the new U.S. agenda for Africa, is engagement of private sector. We speak also of a concept of impact investment, where you get the private sector investing for profit, but also for certain social cause. So we need to get, because the situation is very complex, we need to get involved private sector too in order to get the best outcome. And that's a Millennium Corporate Challenge Corporation and some other activities in US and also in Europe.
Thank you. Conscious of time, I think we've got about, although the time has just disappeared, but I think it's about 10 minutes we've got, something like that, until the end, unless we've just been given a massive extension into the evening. I want to pose a hopefully a slightly challenging question to Miroslav in the first place. Do you worry about a change of US administration back to Trump, or do you think that it won't matter too much? Do you think that the re-engagement maybe now is taking place because of, I don't know, the economy, if nothing else, and particularly for Europe, I was thinking of...
I actually do worry about that, because it's not just about, I don't know, multilateralism, re-engagement, disengagement, isolationism. It's also about rhetoric. It's also about the way of thinking, the mentality, which I don't like, with leaders who like to see enemies in the others, who like to confront the world with the dilemmas which are, let's say, dangerous for all of us, and who would like to impose, excuse me for the word, political primitivism. I was a member of the European Council when we met people from the previous administration, and as somebody said before, we were humiliated by that administration. It was not very nice. We were more polite. We did all we could to, let's say, to provide for certain, let's say, atmosphere which was not too detrimental for the cause. But it was very difficult to collaborate in such an atmosphere. So I really am afraid of seeing another radical change. I mean, I'm not afraid of Republicans or Democrats in any, but if there is a radical leader there who then, has such an influence, as Mr. Trump has already shown, I mean, this might be really dangerous. And just let me say, to add something else, I don't think that to picture anybody as an enemy is a very productive thing. It's a very bad thing, especially in politics and in the world politics. I mean, leaders do that, but it ends someday in a very big conflict or in a war. So that's why I'm much more inclined to use more diplomatic language, knowing everything we know. But still, this gives us some space to show or to reestablish some respect at some point, if there is no respect before. So it is, the words matters and the leader matters. So I'm a bit afraid, but not so pessimistic as it might look right now.
Thank you. I did realise in the timer we've now got apparently 2 minutes, not 7, not 10. Anyway, remember that, apologies, but very quickly, if you could, yeah, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية قامت بتشكيل حلف عسكري يضم الولايات المتحدة، بريطانيا، أستراليا، بمعزل عن حلف الناتو، بمعزل عن دول الاتحاد الأوروبي. وبعد أسابيع قامت بتشكيل حلف يعتبر ناتو آسيوي، أي الولايات المتحدة، الهند، اليابان، أستراليا. في نفس التوقيت تقوم الولايات هذا يشكل خطرا على الأمن بالنسبة للأوروبيين، يعتقدون أن هذا تعرية أمنية. وفي نفس الوقت تقوم الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بتفكيك بعض بطاريات الصواريخ من منطقة الخليج وسحبها دون توفير أدوات تأمين أخرى لهذه الدول التي تعتبر صديقة للولايات المتحدة. أعتقد أن مثل هذه الإجراءات هي إجراءات لا تتأخذ على مستوى الإدارة فقط، بل المؤسسات الأمريكية. إذن هناك خطر أو هناك عدم ثقة حقيقي في الإجراءات الأمريكية تجاه الحلفاء. العالم كله يمكن أن يخرج بسلام أو بأقل الأضرار من مغامرات الحزب الديمقراطي أو الجمهوري في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية إذا ما اجتمع الجميع لوقف الحرب في أوكرانيا. بأي ثمن سوف يكون أقل من الثمن الكارثي في حال استمرار الحرب. آثار الحرب سياسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لها دور كبير في آثار الحرب الكارثية على العالم الثالث وأفريقيا وأوروبا. ليس من مصلحة الولايات المتحدة أو العالم أن تستمر هذه الحرب التي تعتبر الإدارة الأمريكية عامل مهم في إطالة عمرها أو إيقافها. وشكرا للميديز، شكرا للمغرب، شكرا للخبراء والمسؤولين جميعا، وشكرا للحضور.
Well, thank you very much. The time has run away from us, so I won't bother with a sort of a summary of all the issues we've discussed because there have been too many, but certainly push back on the initial question and some robust views all round. So just last for me to say, look, thank you to you all for coming this afternoon and for your excellent questions as well. I'm glad we had some good discussion there as well. But most importantly, to the expert panel, they've been fantastic. Thank you very much for your time today.